This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Sasha Grischuk taking on Magnus Carlsen at the 2014 FIDE World Blitz Championship. Grischuk is one of the strongest Blitz players of all time. He is going to be a very difficult opponent for the world champion. And the game starts off with a Queen's Gambit defense, one of the oldest and most reputable openings in all of chess, and one of the most solid defenses, as Magnus Carlsen is known for playing very solidly in the opening. And an interesting choice early on, Magnus pushes his c-pawn up to c6, which leads to what's called the semi-Slav structure. So this actually isn't anymore a full Queen's Gambit decline. This is now a semi-Slav, but it's not a conventional semi-Slav either. You don't see the dark squared bishops get exchanged this quickly in the semi-Slav all the time. And who does that trade of dark squared bishops benefit? I think it favors white. Black is now stuck with a relatively passive bishop on c8, but the good news for Magnus is that his pawn structure is incredibly solid. There are no holes in black's position, and this is just going to be a very, very difficult structure for white to crack in the blitz game. And of course, Grischuk, as is his reputation, taking his time and slowly ambling that bishop up to d3, continuing his development, and Magnus does the same as he castles Kingside. I think Grischuk is going to castle Kingside as well. Of course, white could also make the decision to castle Queenside, move the queen up to c2, and then castle Queenside, but that just doesn't seem to be Grischuk's style. He prefers a more solid type of position, but I think he's putting a lot of thought into the prospect of castling Queenside here, so much so that he's already down a full minute on the clock, and he does decide on queen c2. But this is a good standalone move. It attacks the pawn on h7. It sets up the queen bishop battery, so this doesn't necessarily mean that Grischuk is going to castle Queenside. But that is what's going to define the subsequent course of the game. Which way is white going to castle? Is the battle going to be positional or tactical? Magnus brings his knight back from the rim to f6 in order to defend the h7 pawn. The knight rejoins society, and I have no doubt that white is slightly better here. White's got better control of the center, a more active position. But the hard thing about playing these types of positions in blitz is, like I mentioned earlier, the fact that black's position is solid as a fortress. No holes, no targets, and Grischuk is going to have to massage this position for many, many moves. And Sasha now falling behind an entire minute on the clock, as he is wont to do. Which way is he going to castle? That is the question. You can sense the wheels turning on his head, in his brain, and c takes d5 is his decision. A trade of pawns in the center, leading to what's called the Carlsbad pawn structure, which is defined by the c6 and d5 and d4 and e3 pawns, and g4. What a decision by Alexander Grischuk as he rumbles the pawn up the board, and his idea was to push g5, but Magnus preparing for that by pushing his rook from f8 to e8, and the idea is to meet g5 with knight f6 to e4, and so Grischuk decides to delay g5, and instead there is the answer to the long-awaited question. Castles Queenside. You can sense that it is blood which is on Grischuk's mind here. He wants to checkmate Magnus Carlsen on the kingside, but hey, Magnus wants to do the exact same thing to white on the other side of the board. Bishop c8 to e6 by the world champion, completing his development. And that bishop on e6 is not as passive as it looks. If black plays the move knight f6 to e4 and something gets traded on e4, that bishop on e6 is going to open up some pressure on the a2 pawn. And so Grischuk, with his last move, knight g5, he is trying to eliminate that bishop. He takes it off the board, and he softens whatever blow black can orchestrate on the queenside. Bishop f5 is Grischuk's follow-up as he continues to keep the initiative going on the kingside, and he moves the pawn up to h4, and storm clouds are beginning to gather around black's king. Now Grischuk threatens to push the g-pawn up to g5 and explode the entire kingside. And if the h-file opens, if white manages to open the h-file, black is going to be in very, very serious trouble. That queen from c2 can very easily get over to h5, it can get over to h3, or in a future situation, Grischuk could push his f-pawn up to f3 and then slide the queen laterally from c2 over to h2. So Magnus, whatever he does, cannot allow the h-file to get opened, and it's no surprise that he is taking a significant amount of time here to decide how he wants to deal with white's kingside attack. And there's our answer, knight f6 to e4, precipitating a trade in the center. Grischuk takes on e4 with his bishop, and there's that g5 move. And my guess is that Magnus is going to meet that with h5, and he does indeed. But Grischuk, he pushes the pawn up to g6. He is not to be denied. He insists on ripping the kingside open. Knight d5 is an excellent defensive response by Magnus. that knight from d5 is threatening to jump into b4 and then infiltrate that d3 square, which is anchored by the pawn on e4. If the pawn on e4 is to be captured here, then knight b4 comes with even more unpleasant effect, because white's queen is then going to have to stay pegged to the e4 knight. So it's going to have to drop back to b1, leaving the white king incredibly exposed. I don't think Grischuk can take the pawn on e4. He's already down to 30 seconds on the clock. It's time to make a decision. And yes, he does take the pawn on e4. What a bold call by Alexander Grischuk. And my guess is that he's actually going to move the knight, and he does. Knight g5 by Grischuk. That is the only saving resource. And Magnus, you could sense the frustration, and that forces a queen trade. Knight takes c2, knight takes f7, mutually assured destruction. Both queens are off the board, and Magnus noticed that intermezzo. The knight from c2, before disappearing off the board, sacrificed itself for the e3 pawn. That's called a desperado move. That restores the material equality. And now we have on our hands a 4 rook endgame, a double rook endgame, where both sides are desperately trying to activate their rooks. Magnus doubling on the e-file and Grischuk moving his rook up to h3. That rook on h3 is a hero. It's defending both of white's weak pawns on e3 and h4. But it is amazing that Magnus has managed to get this into an endgame. At one point, after Grischuk moved his pawns up to g4 and h4, it looked like mate was inevitable. And now Sasha is and it's hard to even say. He's 90 seconds down on the clock, but we know how incredible Grischuk is with his last seconds ticking off his clock, and he pushes up to b4. Make no mistake, Alexander Grischuk is still very much playing for a win. He's got that ultra active rook sitting pretty on d6, and right now his strategy is to push his queenside pawns up, which is exactly what he's doing. a4 threatening b4, b5, and if Grischuk trades Magnus's c6 pawn off the board, then the d4 pawn is going to become a protected passed pawn. But is Grischuk willing to sacrifice a pawn in order to achieve that goal? He's got 5 seconds to decide, and he decides with a yes. B5 is on the board, and he does sacrifice a pawn, but he's insisting on making that sacrifice temporary. Rook b6, and he's going to recover if he wants the pawn on b5, but instead he plays rook g3, harassing the pawn on g6 and forcing Magnus to give the lateral checks. A repetition of moves here is very likely. Grischuk doesn't mind a draw. He's got 10 seconds on the board, or does he? Will he play king e1? No, he goes king d3, and now it's up to Magnus to decide whether he wants to repeat the move. Now, in Blitz, you cannot claim a 3-move repetition, even though the position has been repeated 3 moves, because neither side is keeping score. So there is no proof, unless an arbiter is watching, that the position has been repeated. It's a fascinating rule in Blitz, and the sides continue to repeat moves. But finally, Grischuk is the one who deviates. He was thinking on Magnus's time, and he decides that with 11 seconds, he still wants to play for a win. What a gutsy call by Grischuk, but I think the game is still very likely to end in a draw, because Magnus has snagged the pawn on e3, and the black king is surrounded by that defensive cocoon composed of the rook on e7. I don't think black's king is under any danger. Rook takes h5, rook takes d4, both sides liquidating each other's pawns, and now all that both sides have left is just one pawn. Magnus still needs to be careful. Black's king is in a little bit of danger, a little bit of hot water, but those black rooks are doing such a capable job of keeping the king well protected. And now Grischuk sees no alternative but to slide his king up to b5. And now I think the result of the game is no longer in question. Let's see how Magnus navigates the last couple of moves here, and navigates them well. He moves his king all the way from the king side to the queen side. What an interesting storyline. Black's king started on the king side. It was under tremendous duress, and it ends the game as the sides shake hands and agree to the peace treaty on the queen side, surrounded by his pawn. A phenomenal defensive effort by Magnus and a great attacking effort by Grischuk. If you like this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist. Thank you so much for watching.